going to start the second day's proceedings of the 4-day international conference on 50 years of Bangladesh, retrospect and prospect. Today, this is the first panel is on Bangladesh's economic transformation. And here, I think the session will be chaired by Professor Wahiduddin Mahmood. I would like to hand over the mic to Professor Wahiduddin Mahmood.
Thank you, Mazem. I believe it's panel 3, the second day panel 3 of CPD Cornell International Conference on 50 years of Bangladesh, prospect and retrospect and prospect. The topic of today's panel is Bangladesh's economic transformation, and a very important topic. And I should just say a few words that the narratives on Bangladesh's economic development has changed over the years, and alternative narratives. Given the odds, particularly initial years of the war-ravaged economy, there were gloomy predictions, we know about that, but the economy has undergone vast changes. Bangladesh has graduated from the LDC status recently, but before that, 5-6 years ago, Bangladesh became a low middle income country from a low income country according to World Bank's definition. And Bangladesh is now one of the fastest growing economies. It has been one of the fastest growing economies among the developing countries for the last few decades. Even now, it's one of the fastest growing economies in spite of the coronavirus impact. And I said that there are alternative narratives on Bangladesh's story. Some has called it a development paradox or development surprise. Others think that, of course, by the benefit of hindsight, that it's not a paradox. It's what was to be expected, given the inspiration behind the liberation war and the expectations of the people and the way people responded to opportunities, and all the governments, at least for their legitimacy, played a developmental role. But even then, there remains, however you interpret the narratives, there remains the challenges which lie ahead. And given the interrogation of these alternative narratives is an useful exercise not only for understanding Bangladesh's path of development and the future challenges, but also it can provide lessons for other less developed countries. Now, today we have a very interesting and distinguished list of panels and discussants. They are all of them. I won't introduce them individually, but I will say that all are very research active, keen observers of the Bangladesh development scenario. They're well known in their profession. They're internationally published authors, and all happen to be among my brightest former students at Dhaka University. Dr. Mustafiz is the only exception, but I'm sure that you don't mind if I say that he almost fits into the same category. So without much ado, should I explain the rules? All the speakers, the panelists will speak for 14 minutes. After that, the designated discussant will speak for 7 minutes. And the panelist immediately after that will can give his first response in 4 minutes. And then we shall, after the panelists and the discussants have already talked, we shall have some time for question and answer, where everyone who are present will be welcome to put questions, which should be very brief, and which either you can write it and transmit it through your chat box, or you can speak, provided it's very brief and it should be very pointed to a particular panelist. So with those rules set, and Dr. Muazzam is here to keep the timetable and remind you of the time limit. I would now invite Dr. Syed Akhtar Mahmood. He will former lead private sector specialist of the World Bank. He was also at IFC when he retired. He will speak on synergies and tipping points, policy actions, market responses, and economic growth in Bangladesh. Akhtar Mahmood has already made a deal with me that he can take 2 more minutes than allotted, but he can sacrifice out of the 4 minutes of response. Okay, Sam? Okay.
Okay, sir.
Dr. Syed Akhtar Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahmood. And I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference, in particular, Professor Raunak Jahan and Professor Rehman Subhan, for inviting me to present at this conference and be part of this very distinguished panel. I'll actually try to see if I can finish within 14 minutes and keep the 4 minutes for responses to Dr. Murshid. I have been doing some research over the past several months on the history of economic policymaking in Bangladesh. And one of the motivations behind doing that has already been mentioned by Professor Mahmood, which is the need to understand the role of successive governments in creating the policy environment, which also includes public investment programs, which have actually created the space in which the entrepreneurial talents of Bangladeshis have been unleashed. And that, I believe, is a major part of the story in terms of explaining the growth performance, the economic transformation, and the overall development performance. But there's another reason why I embarked on this particular project. I've had a long-standing interest in understanding the processes by which policies are formulated. So you may say I'm interested in the stories behind the stories. So not just documenting policies and analyzing their impact, but trying to understand the dynamics which lead a government to take certain policies. The debates, the discussions, the various forces, the drivers, the dynamics, if you may call it. And that brings me to the second motivation behind doing this, which is more forward-looking, that if you want to influence government policymaking going forward, if you want to steer policymaking in certain directions, it's very important to understand the machinery. It's not enough to come up with good analysis. It's not enough to make sensible recommendations. It's important to understand the machinery through which policies are formulated and then implemented. Therefore, looking back into how the machinery has operated in the past, I think is particularly useful. So with those introductory words, I'll start sharing the screen here. I have a presentation. So let's see. So I'm calling my presentation, as Professor Mahmood has said, Synergies and Tipping Points. And in a moment, I'll explain both these concepts. But let me start with the first chart, which for some reason it's not moving here. Okay, I'll have to use this. So this is something which you're all familiar with, the long-term GDP growth pattern in Bangladesh, starting from 61 to 2019, that entire 60-year period can be divided into 3 phases. The first phase was of widely fluctuating GDP growth, then a phase of more steady but modest GDP growth, ranging between 3 to 5% annually. And then at the turn of the century, we entered a phase of accelerating GDP growth. And in trying to explain this, one of the features that I noticed in the long run trend of various economic variables is this concept of tipping points and great accelerations. So what do I mean by that? If you look at the long-term trajectory of different important economic variables, you'll see that the value of these variables go on rising. That's the usual pattern. But within that, you'll see some tipping points. And after the tipping points, you see what I call great accelerations. In other words, there is a significant increase in the absolute value of the variables, and often an increase in the growth rate as well, but certainly in the absolute value of the variables, where you see an increase of 4 times, 5 times, 6 times within a short span of 7 to 8 years, or at most 10 years. And that's what I called the great acceleration. And it's important for us to understand why these accelerations happen. Even more importantly, what's the implication of these accelerations? And here's one example. So this is mobile phone subscriptions. Mobile phones started in the early 90s. For a long time, the growth rate was modest, and then something happened. Something happened around 2005, and the trajectory changed significantly, and subscriptions started rising at a very fast rate. And we know now in 2021, subscriptions have actually exceeded the total population of Bangladesh. So that's one example. But the interesting story is that we have seen a series of such tipping points and great accelerations throughout the post-independence period. And I'll come to that chart, which is possibly the most important chart, or at least one of the most important charts in the presentation. Let me just explain something. In creating that chart, I have normalized the values of the variables so that the year in which there's a tipping point, the value takes the value of 100. So it's indexed to 100. And I had to do it so that I can show all the variables with their different units of measurement on the same chart. So for some reason, the enter button is not clicking, so I'll have to try this. So the first one you're very familiar with. This is export earnings starting in the mid-80s. This is the first of a few great accelerations in export. This one lasted for about, let's say, a decade and a half, by which time export earnings increased 5 times. 5 times in a very short period of time. The next one is remittances. Again, a very rapid increase in a short span of time. This is mobile financial services coming later. But before all this happened, there was a significant change in the economic orientation of Bangladesh's policy stance. We moved from a socialist path towards a more private sector oriented path in the 70s. And that's reflected in the share of private sector credit as a share in total bank credit. It was below 25% in the early 70s. By the mid-80s, it had risen to 75%, and then it rose even farther. This one is the famous rural road expansion. Again, a very significant expansion starting in the late 1980s, and a 5-fold increase in the network in under a decade. This is power generation capacity. Again, significant increase happening much later. This one is interesting. This is agricultural machinery imports. You see a big spike starting in the mid-90s. And the last one is mobile financial services. You're all familiar with bKash and all the other mobile financial providers. So you see a series of these accelerations. And an important question is, are these related to each other? Now, unless you believe that everything in the world is related to each other, in which case I'm sure there's a relationship between all of them, but there are relationships between some of them, in the sense that you have a great acceleration in one or more variables, which lead to a great acceleration in another variable down the road. And I think that is a very, very powerful part of the story of Bangladesh's economic transformation. And that brings us to the important concept of synergy among economic variables. And my submission in this presentation is that one of the major parts of the explanations of our development performance is to be found in synergies, 2 powerful sets of synergies. Synergies among economic variables, and then underpinning that, synergy between policy making and market responses. Let me start with the first one first, the synergy among economic variables. And I'm giving an example from the rural economy for the period 1980 to 2010. Irrigation, rural roads, remittances led to growth of agriculture. So that was the synergy. This is the rural road, and you can see the spike, which I mentioned a moment ago. This is remittances. You can see that big spike happening after the late 90s. And this is irrigation. And the three together lead to an inflection point in crop production. And that's the vertical line you see around 97, 98. So there are a lot of studies which have provided evidence showing that indeed synergy existed, which had its impact on agricultural growth. And not only agriculture, but also, go there, non-farm activities in the rural areas. So in the year 2000, the share of non-farm employment in rural employment was under 40%. By 2016 is almost the same as agricultural employment. This is another example, a more recent example of synergy between mobile phone growth and the growth in mobile financial services, which happened 7 or 8 years after that spike in mobile phone subscriptions. I could also put in here the growth in internet subscriptions and the growth which has just started in e-commerce, another set of interesting synergies. Now, the synergy between policy and market responses, and I'll have to move fast, I think, because I'm probably running out of time. So here is a model of policy dynamics that I employ in my study. So you have developments in the economy, which are driven by economic actors, farmers, businessmen, industrialists, traders. And these developments are noticed by the government, often on its own, without any prompting by others. And government may take policy actions in response to the developments in the economy, because they want to influence the developments in a particular direction. But sometimes the economic actors demand policy actions. Sometimes there are policy intermediaries, economists, other professionals, donors, even journalists, who study the developments, who notice the developments. They identify various issues which need addressing, and they suggest policy actions. And the government takes those policy actions, and these actions, this is important, these actions in turn affect the economy. So there's a two-way synergy going on between developments in the marketplace or economy and policy action. And my submission is that in the course of the 50 years of our independence, these kind of synergies, on the one hand between economic variables, on the other hand between government and responses in the market, this synergy has played out again, again, and again. And this is not a phenomenon that you see in many other developing countries. But in Bangladesh, synergies have played out again and again and again. And this has created a process of powerful cumulative change. And the process of cumulative change has become more and more powerful over time, leading to the acceleration in growth rates that we see in recent times. I will just give one example of this two-way synergy using the example of agricultural policy reform. These are the 7 areas that I've studied so far. I'm not going to that. But this is the, I'll go very quickly through this. The agricultural input market liberalization in the 80s and 90s. The green boxes show developments in the economy. We start with rice production moving to a trajectory of sustained growth in the mid-70s, but within the public sector model, which leads to a demand for creating space for the private sector. The blue boxes
12
show
minutes have passed.
Sorry?
12 minutes have passed.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll be on time more or less. And in the early 80s, there were some reforms to expand the space for private sector. These reforms triggered some market responses, the second green box that you see, but the market responses revealed some additional constraints, and more ambitious reforms were demanded, but they were rather slow in coming. Then in the mid to late 1980s, something interesting happened. The agricultural growth slowed down. There were devastating floods in 87, 88. The then finance minister, Mr. Zaman, many of you know him very well, he commissioned an agricultural sector review led by Professor John Mellor, which recommended bolder reforms. These reforms were already being talked about, but were not necessarily finding a resonance. But now the bold reforms were undertaken, And the last box, which I'm not going to go into detail, the blue box, talks about the very ambitious reforms carried out in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and then actually sustained when the regime changed in 96, which is very interesting. This expansion of the role of the private sector and the market, that those reforms were actually sustained. So what do we get from the studies of the 7 areas that I've carried out so far? Knowledge, evidence, and analysis is very important. But this knowledge will not be received well if there isn't support in the bureaucracy for the policy actions that are being proposed, and if there's no buy-in in political leadership. These, in turn, depend on a conducive political economy, favorable public opinion, and often, because we get a lot of support from external agents, the support has to be timely. And based on all these things, the government of Bangladesh, and this is very interesting, the approach has always been rather cautious, testing the market. Government does a little bit, tests the market, see what happens, and then goes for more reforms. So Bangladesh doesn't have episodes of dramatic reforms, and maybe that's the reason why we don't have episodes like in other countries of dramatic reversals. Often there was a confluence of different agendas. So the mobile financial services that picked up following a regulatory reform in 2011 actually benefited from the fact that there was a confluence of 3 agendas: the digital Bangladesh agenda, the financial inclusion agenda of the Bangladesh Bank, and the mobile phone expansion agenda of the government. These 3 things came together. And as we saw in the earlier example, often there are developments which may be negative in many senses, the floods, slowing down of agricultural growth, but they may be fortuitous in pushing forward the reform momentum. I'm going to quote from Radwan Mujib Siddiq, who edits a magazine called Whiteboard. And he said something about the Digital Bangladesh program, which is interesting. The plan was lay the infrastructure, ensure access, and see what happens. See what happens. Test the market. The rapid rate of digitalization in the country over the last decade or so shows that policymakers were right to gamble on innovation. Gamble. So we have many examples of gambling. The people of the country proved to be enthusiastic adopters of technology and quickly grasped how to apply it in their daily lives. Those of you who are familiar, and I'm sure all of you are, with Albert Hirschman's unbalanced growth theory, may see a flavor of a Hirschmanian approach here. You don't always know exactly what will happen, but you take a gamble. Now,
your time is over. You have
right. So I just
minutes.
have one little quote, because at the root of all these are the entrepreneurs of Bangladesh. And here's a quote from an entrepreneur, a garment entrepreneur, who's also a university professor. He's in his early 60s, and this is what he told me recently. Bangladesh used to be called a basket case, and we wanted to prove this wrong. The desire within us to do something was quite indomitable. We were the next generation of after independence. Some of our friends had given up hope, but we had confidence that we can do big things. And indeed, they did big things, which we are now celebrating, but also trying to understand. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmood. You have spoken so much that I can forfeit your even entire 4 minutes of response, because you have really explained everything. Okay, the discussant, designated discussant, I'll call upon Dr. Khan Ahmed Sayed Murshid. He is the immediate former Director General, BIDS.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Murshid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
My power is gone.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes, thank you. And let me thank the organizers, CPD and Cornell, for inviting me to participate in this seminar. Let me not waste any time and get straight to the point. Now, what Akhtar has done, I think it's an extremely interesting paper, and I understand that it is still a work in progress. And I think that there is a very interesting paper here in terms of throwing some light on a black box, on the policy black box that very few people have actually addressed in the past. This is an extremely difficult exercise because there are, I think, at least 2 or 3 objectives that Akhtar here is trying to address. One is that he is looking at policy with the stated intention of trying to redress what I would call a historical, not a wrong, but asymmetry, where the role of non-state actors has been highlighted, and the role of state actors has therefore received diminished importance in the context of Bangladesh's development narrative. And so this is a crucial exercise for us to understand actually what has been the role of the state in Bangladesh's economic and development performance. Now, Akhtar basically looks at economic performance in the sense of looking at GDP per capita. So he doesn't really look at development as such. And his focus is not just creating a new narrative, which I think he also does, but also try to explore some of the underlying processes that have contributed to this narrative. So congratulations to Akhtar, and I'm sure this is going to end up in a very good publication. Now, in terms of its framework, I like the framework, and I think it's a very reasonable way to start. It's intuitively appealing, easy to understand. But when I look at the chart, the first chart that he showed us, the most immediate thing that strikes you is that up to about 1982-83, there's these huge oscillations, and then suddenly there is this, like if you look at a patient in a hospital and you see him going brain dead, you see the oscillations sort of peter off, and it becomes almost like just a small bubbles on the sea. And this is not explained anywhere. I mean, not just Akhtar. I don't think anybody really goes into this, because this is really odd. Because at that time, and we can say that this is because of all the issues with agriculture and so on and so forth. But up to 82-83, when we see this smoothing of the growth curve, nothing really happened. What happened was very minor reforms, which would have an impact further down. But this huge change in the growth pattern prior to 1983 and after 1983, this remains a mystery. And I don't think anybody's addressed that completely anyway. So, but that's really not such a great point to make. But in terms of inflections or its tipping points, what I would say is that, look, it kind of reminds me of the last straw on the camel's back. Now, when you get to the tipping point, you've already generated a lot of development energy, growth energy, which is not yet in evidence. But it's at one fine point, it emerges. So what is interesting is not just to identify the tipping point and what policies immediately preceded it, but also to look at all the various other policies or developments or initiatives or interventions that have gone prior to that, preceding that moment. And therefore, it is a challenge to actually try and establish causality between policy, past interventions.
You have 2 minutes.
Oh dear. All right. Okay. So basically, I think that first of all, Akhtar's characterization of the policy environment or the way the policy dynamics work, I think that there are serious questions about that. For example, he misses out the role of special interest groups. He misses out much of the political economy debates. He misses out the donor agenda, the new liberal agenda. And so I think there are large missing gaps. It's an interesting story, and it probably tells us, gives us some aspect of the policy dynamics, but it is by far not complete. And there's some essential missing elements. I mean, there are large parts of the story, development story, that is missing, and which must certainly have had an impact on growth. For example, the fertility decline. For example, the huge revolution that I would say took place in the non-farm, aquaculture, dairy, and so on. And also the explanations around mobile financial services and e-commerce. These came much later, and so this cannot really inform us on what has already happened. These further down the line, this may have a great impact. Mobile phones, yes, because it has had an impact on the market. Special economic zones, again, these are, I mean, down the line may have a huge impact, but we don't see that happening yet. So those are the sorts of issues that I've had. In fact, I've had a little conversation with Akhtar, and I've shared most of my observations with him. And as I said, this is work in progress, and I'm sure there's still additional work to be done, but we have a very interesting potential paper here. So let me just end by saying
the time is over.
Bangladesh has been a good student of the neoliberal agenda. And thing is, now that we don't need to be a good student anymore because we don't have so much aid to worry about.
The time is over.
What lies in the future is that we don't know whether the discipline that the neoliberal agenda brought to us can be reinstated in some other fashion. So thank you once again, and I hope I made some sense. But congratulations again, Dr. Thank you.
Yeah, you made enormous sense, Murshid. And Akhtar, you can respond now if you have some quick response. Akhtar?
Very quick. I'll just take a minute, a minute and a half. So it's definitely work in progress. And talking about the determinants of policy, the policy dynamics chart that I had, I think we should interpret that as showing only the first layer. That's the first layer. And we can overlay that with more layers. So obviously, political economy, which I mentioned in passing, is an important part of a layer. The influence of donors, another part of the layer. So there are layers that can be added on that basic policy dynamics framework that I had presented there. As I said at the beginning, I started on this research journey, not so much to understand the economic dynamics, but more to understand the policy dynamics. But as I went into it, and in particular after I got invitation to present in this conference, where the session is on economic transformation, I started looking at the synergies between economic variables as well. And as my work proceeds, I'll go deeper into that. The one point that Dr. Murshid mentioned about trying to understand how the tipping points happen. As you saw in that example with the agricultural sector, the rural sector, there is a tipping point in crop production around in the late 90s. But preceding that, I showed the expansion of rural road network, the expansion of irrigation, the jump in remittances. The big jump came later, but there was a growing inflow of remittances. Now, all of these were not done with the aim of increasing agricultural production. Some were, but others were not. But in some way, they came together and created that spike. So you see a bit of a flavor of that attempt to try and understand the tipping points. But I agree that that is indeed one of the interesting challenges, having documented the existence of the tipping points to understand what happened in the years preceding that.
Good. Excellent. Akhtar, thank you. May I now call upon not in order, it's I'll call him second panelist, Professor Mustafizur Rahman. He will talk about Bangladesh transitioning to a sustainable post-graduation future. I believe post-graduation means post-LDC graduation, if I'm not wrong. So, Mustafiz?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. It's an honor to present this paper in presence of so many luminaries, and particularly, sir, I may not be your direct student, but you have always been my teacher. So I am not almost a student. I am always a student, sir. You have always been.
I forgot to introduce you as Distinguished Fellow of CPD.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Dear audience, let me first of all register my deep appreciation to Professor Rehman Subhan, Professor Ronak Jahan for this great opportunity. And as sir was mentioning at the very beginning, that the narrative is changing, and one of the changing narratives is the graduation that Bangladesh has been able to make. And in this, when we celebrate 50 years of Bangladesh's independence, and obviously this is a great recognition of the path that we've over the past 5 decades since our independence. Now, as sir was mentioning about the middle income graduation and LDC graduation, so my focus will be how to go forward in with regard to making these graduations sustainable. And also, if we recall, the Bangladesh Vision 2041 document has set the target of transitioning to a developed country by 2041. So my motivation for this work that I have done is to look at the challenges of LDC graduation, how to address these challenges from the perspective of external sector, and also to look at the middle income graduation and the pitfalls of the journey that many countries have experienced in going forward in the middle income journey. So I have tried to look at this dual graduation and the challenges of addressing the tasks of making the graduation sustainable from an external sector performance lens. So with regard to the LDC graduation, the point that I'm making is that we will have to make a transition from predominantly preferential market access based competitiveness to a skills and productivity based competitiveness. And in that context, what I am proposing is that our offensive interest should be entering into the regional markets, which have so far remained largely unexploited. And with regard to the middle income graduation, I think I'm proposing that we will have to pursue a defensive strategy so that we don't fall into the middle income trap that many countries have experienced. Now, what will be the implications of the dual graduation, the LDC graduation and the middle income graduation? And we see that it will be with regard to the loss of various international support measures in the WTO. There are 183 special and differential treatment that is provided to the LDCs. We see in bilaterally through GSP schemes or regionally like SAFTA, Bangladesh gets duty-free, quota-free market access. So that's the second. And third, obviously, is that middle-income graduation entails that concessional financing will be gradually reduced, and it will be more market-based financing. And there, many countries have fallen into middle-income trap, and Bangladesh's, if offensive interest is to get into the regional market, the defensive interest will be to make trade work for not getting into the middle income trap. So that's what I'm proposing in my paper. And with regard to the LDC graduation, my understanding is that the implications will be felt in 4 areas: domestic policy making and policy flexibility, obligations and compliance and requirements, that's domestic space. And in the global space, it will be terms of market access, obviously when preferences will not be there, and the degree of reciprocity in dealing with our partners, because it will be mostly non-reciprocity, which will be the basis of our relationship. With regard to the implications for the middle income journey, obviously there will be a transition from grant concessional based borrowings to a blend of concessional and non-concessional borrowings, two primarily non-concessional. So what we are talking about is this less than 1% of interest. We are talking about market-based LIBOR plus 3-4%, which comes to about 5-6%. So lower maturity period, lower grace period, more stringent credit conditionalities. So many countries have experienced, and ours also. Surely the public debt will be increasing, and there will be more debt servicing liability. Many countries have fallen into lower middle income trap or upper middle income trap as they transited from low income to lower middle income to upper middle income countries. So that's the motivation. So I think that going forward, we will have to deploy three identities. One is that there are 5 years till 2026. We will have to use this window. The second is that Bangladesh, as a graduating LDC, has submitted proposals for extension of various support measures for some years after graduation. But the most important is the third identity, which Professor Rehman Subhan was mentioning the other day at a seminar, that we will have to think about the new identity, which is as a developing country. So I look at the LDC, sustainable LDC graduation from the perspective of a developing country. So what happens when these preferences are not there? So what I have in detail proposed in the study is that our regional markets, like the East Asian market, ASEAN market, and the South Asian markets, these are our next big frontiers of export expansion. Now, these regions, they import about $492 billion, which is 28% of the global import. And Bangladesh's export to this region is only 0.1%, so 0.1% of our share in that. So it's about $5 billion. So and if we look at between 2010 and 2021, we see that in these three regions, the export share has increased only from 10% to 12% of our total export. So it remains largely unexplored. On the other hand, these countries have taken advantage of Bangladesh's import. We import about 68% from this region and export only 12%. Now, one of the major reasons, as you know, and I have calculated the concentration index. If you can see, Vietnam is 0.17, whereas Bangladesh is 0.41. So the divergence index was a very high divergence from the global average. So this is one of the reasons. But the argument that I make is that if we look at the regional market, then they also import ready-made garments, but it's more non-synthetic, which is the expanding market. 78% of the global market is non-synthetic, and our export basket shows only 22% in that segment. So this high concentration is in cotton. So if we want to get into the regional market, I think intra-RMG diversification is a major opportunity. We always talk about product diversification, but we have a strong foothold in a market which is $700 billion. Now, the other issue I wanted to see, what is the GVC linkages, the value chain linkages within the region and outside of the region. And we see that Bangladesh's backward and forward value chain linkage is only 13%. Compare it with Vietnam, 67%, meaning that there are production networks, there are regional value chains which allow these countries to get into the regional market, where Bangladesh is falling behind. So this estimations is quite revealing. If we look at also the technological embeddedness of our export, which I have estimated, we see that Bangladesh is still in the low technology segment of the market, and that also gives us a lack of export opportunities, and also competitiveness implications of this is very high. On the other hand, if you look at the high technology, between 2010 and 2020, Vietnam has increased its export percentage from 10% to 40%. whereas we are stuck at less than 1%. So these estimations are also very revealing. If we get into what is within the product basket, what is the intra product diversification, and that also is shown by the extended market reach, the value of which I have calculated. Now, so this is also quite revealing and shows that within the product also there are concentration. Now, what we have here also calculated is that if we go into regional closer economic cooperation by setting up regional trading arrangements like CEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or FTA, with countries where we now get preferential access. And then on the other hand, if we get into, obviously in that case, the implications of preferential erosion will be contained. With countries which we don't get preferences, we export at MF and tariff, most favored nation tariff. If we get into those markets, we will have additional export. So I have estimated what is the untapped potential in the regional markets, and it's quite high, 61% in South Asia, Southeast and in ASEAN, in South Asia 40%, in East Asia 58%. These are untapped resources if we go into more RTA. So and here, if we go into product space analysis, we find that Bangladesh still has a lot of opportunities in the products that we are exporting, but through intra-product diversification. And there is also another group where light engineering, assembling, production equipments, machineries that Vietnam has done, that is another. So this shows clusters where you can take advantage of already what you have. You have 2 minutes left. Oh, so my God. If we look at the middle income trap, we can see that how Bangladesh's external debt servicing, our external borrowings are increasing. In FY 2010, it was only $2.2 billion. Now it is $7.2 billion, and this fiscal year it is $10.3 billion. So it will be increasing. And here I show how countries have been stuck in lower middle income trap and upper middle income trap. Countries like Philippines, 34 years in lower middle income trap. Countries like Brazil and Argentina, 33 years in upper middle income trap. So what was their deficiencies? And I have tried to identify why they have fallen into debt trap, and why some other countries like Taiwan and South Korea, they haven't. So this analysis show also, I have tried to show how South Korea differed with those which have fallen into middle income trap, and they have invested on physical capital, on human capital development, increasing total factor productivity. So all these will have important implications. The last point that I want to make is that we are now making a lot of investment. So if we can triangulate our investment, our trade, and our linkages, transport linkages, multimodal transport connectivities, then that can give us a lot of leverage in the regional market, because most of the trade in the regional market will be land-based also. And we are not taking a lot of interest in the logistics and trade facilitation, which gives us competitive edge in the land-based trade. So single window, standardization of customs procedures, interoperability of the systems, transport logistics, all these will become very important if we want to translate our comparative advantages into competitive advantage, and our strategies for LDC graduation and avoiding the middle income trap can be reinforcing and synergistic. So that will be the final message. Thank you, Chair.
Good, Dr. Mustafiz, very excellent presentation. The discussant is Dr. Nazneen Ahmed. Formerly of BIDS, I think still BIDS on loan to UNDP as country economist. I hope that she will come back to BIDS.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very important international seminar, especially to this session. And I think the paper that was presented by my former boss, in fact, I started my career with working with Professor Mustafiz, and also Professor Rehman Sobhan is here. So it's it's an honor for me to comment on this important paper. And I will not repeat what Dr. Mustafiz has mentioned. I think I agree with all of them, but I want to complement some of the issues. Though he has already mentioned that this paper this paper focuses more on the trade aspect of graduation, but I will complement some of the issues which actually is closely related with the trade aspect. So he has mentioned about this dual graduation, LDC graduation and middle income graduation, but again, these two are related. And also with this, I think all our efforts for attaining SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, that is also related, because all these are happening at the same time. So we have to think of this overall framework or overall timing in which all these things are happening. So in that regard, while he rightly mentioned that we now have to move towards more to a skill-based, take a skill-based approach, I would like to say that it's skill and also it's innovation. When we are talking about technology, I think it's very important that we also give stress on innovation, so that there are lots of homegrown technology, innovation which fits to our development path. And the earlier presentation where Dr. Akhtar Mahmood mentioned that how actually policy environment, it's very important to influence the path. So that is also true for our future. Previously, it was like the dynamics that was explained by Dr. Mahmood, Akhtar Mahmood. Those were coming some kind of, with uncertainty. We did not know many things, but now, though there are uncertainties, but some of the issues we already know, that Professor Mustafi said, what could be the scenario when there will not be, when we will go out of the LDC list, and when we will be the middle income country. So we already know some of the things that are coming. So in that regards, I think it's very important how we frame our policies. For example, at the moment, it is the time in terms of the LDC graduation to formulate a smooth transition strategy. In short, it's STS. And currently, government has formed under the Prime Minister's office a very high-powered committee, and there are set up. And one of the committee is Smooth Transition Strategy Committee, which is led by Economic Relations Division, ERD. But here you see the STS or Smooth Transition Strategy has been made one subcommittee. But in my view, it should be the umbrella. So here lies from now on, we have to, think of how we are formulating our policies. Like now, I think with STS, it should be the umbrella. It should not be just a subcommittee, because subcommittee means it is like, there is market access committee, there is committee for intellectual property right, there is committee for branding and all those things. So I think when you have like another subcommittee on STS, it feels like it is working separately. But I think it's very important that this becomes an umbrella policy. And in that umbrella policy, as Professor Mustafiz was mentioning, that how we can go about, all these regional cooperation, bilateral trade agreements. I think it's also very important to before going to those bilateral agreements and others, we also have to have our capacity to negotiate. And not only trade negotiation, it's also very important that we know how to do climate negotiation, how to do negotiation for investment, because those are linked. For example, when our negotiators go for negotiation. You have 2 minutes. Okay, it's not only their skill to how to talk, it's also the skill in terms of taking advantage of the knowledge. So we need a very good knowledge management strategy now. For example, if someone is going for a bilateral trade agreement, the negotiators should have a good backup of different studies, different previous histories, and also connection between the experts, the academia, and the policymakers. I think if when we are planning now, when we are moving towards a smooth transition strategy, it's very important that we take all the preparation. So in Bangla, we say Adghat Bedhenama. So if we look at the 360-degree preparation, that is required at the moment. So I think it's, though we know that LDC graduation or middle income graduation, it's not only about trade, it's very much about being very much about preparing ourselves for a graduated society, that all these activities that CPD is doing in the citizens platform for SDG, those are very important. As a citizen of this country, am I prepared for a graduated country? Am I prepared for behaving like a citizen of a graduated country? So those are very important, and that will give us, when we have skills, that mindset, the policy, and the 360-degree preparation, only then we can make the graduation sustainable and fruitful for us, and we can hopefully avoid the middle income trap. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you, Nazneen. Third panelist is Professor Salim Raihan, Professor, Department of Economics.
No, I think Mustafiz needs to respond. Okay.
Mustafiz
just, yes, of course, for 4 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I would like to thank Dr. Nazneen for excellent comments and also suggestions. I fully agree that it has to be 360-degree preparation, but I wanted to look at more from a granular sense of what actions should be taken. And I thought that one of the key strategies will have to be the trade strategy that we are pursuing. Obviously, it has to be coordinated with others, and you are very right. SDGs, for example, if we are talking about this transition from preference-driven competitiveness to skills and innovation and productivity-driven competitiveness, goal 4, education and quality education will be the key to that. If we are talking about good jobs, goal 8, decent jobs will be key to that. So I think that this synergistic approach and leveraging from the other approaches will be very important. So I fully agree with that. But I wanted to look at the trade prospect that we have in the region, which could be one of the cornerstone of that overall strategy. And I agree with you. Yes, the smooth transition strategy should be an umbrella, because it will have to be it will have to coordinate all the other activities. Negotiations, obviously very important, and as I was mentioning, FTA or SEPA type of negotiation, these are very complex. You will have to identify what are your offers, what are your requests, what are your offensive interests, what are your defensive interests, what are your non-negotiables. So I think that capacity is very much needed at this stage, and I have a suggestion to set up a negotiating capacity. And we say in the WTO jargon that in trade negotiations, countries get not what they deserve but what they negotiate. So, and it will be non-reciprocal negotiations. It's not like LDC, reciprocal negotiation, not like LDC non-reciprocity will be the basis. So I very much agree with you. And you are very right. I think innovation, investing in innovation, all these will help not only LDC graduation, but also will help us. We are borrowing a lot, as I was mentioning, from $2 billion to $10 billion this year. So debt servicing liabilities will go up significantly. So how do we generate the resources in order to pay, and we don't fall into the debt trap like we have seen in the Latin American countries? So we will have to avoid that. And in order to do that, obviously, the capacity to generate the resources, the returns, the internal rate of returns, the financial returns, economic returns will be very important. And there, obviously, institutions, good governance, all these will become, will have to play. And what also Dr. Akhtar Mahmood has mentioned, I think that all together, that will help us in ensuring that the LDC graduation and middle income graduation are sustainable, and we can generate the sort of growth which will be needed, and we don't fall into the middle income trap. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafiz.
Thank you, sir.
Our third panelist is Professor Salim Rahan, Department of Economics, Professor, Department of Economics, Dhaka University, and Executive Director of South Asian Network of Economic Modeling, SANEM. His topic is institutional changes, which is good that it comes after the two presentations, because after all, it's the economic and political institutions which determine whatever you have been proposing, whether that will be actually implemented. So, Professor Salim Rahan.
Thank you, sir. I also thank the organizers for inviting me to this extremely important program. I'm not quite sure whether I'll be able to do the right kind of justice to this topic, because we all should agree that it's a very wide-ranging topic, and there are many issues, but probably I'll try my best to present in 14 minutes some of the important aspects of this topic. So here the title of my presentation is Institutional Challenges in Bangladesh's Economic Transformation. I may sound a bit more critical than the earlier two presenters, because we are talking about institution, we are talking about the quality of institution and the kind of challenges. So, and I also need to mention here that this work, this presentation and the paper is actually based on some of the very extensive work with which I was associated for the last 2.5 years. And what we call institutional diagnostic of Bangladesh, we have come up with a big volume on several chapters. So some of the findings of this paper is actually draw from that work. So here, I just wanted to give a kind of very macro perspective. We wrote a paper in 2020, and then we tried to come up with a synthetic institutional index, actually covering 6 areas. And we used a variety of data from different sources, and tried to come up with, applied some techniques and to come up with index on institutions in 6 areas: democracy, rule of law, business environment, land, bureaucracy, and human rights. So I just want to show you the kind of ranking of Bangladesh, and each of the 6 synthetic index. And you can see that, Bangladesh doesn't really, with respect to ranking, this ranking is out of 105 countries, doesn't really do very well. And here I also tried to mention some of the countries which are actually around Bangladesh, in its ranking. You can see countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, Jordan, Lebanon, or Madagascar, Myanmar, Dominican Republic, So probably the countries where you can see that they're not very, well cited for their, good institution or quality good institution. So the idea is that I'm not really getting into that kind of discussion that why institution is important and why, what role institution can play in development, because I think for the time constant, I should not get into that discussion. But here we all agree that the quality of institution in Bangladesh is not accepted. It's very poor. Where even whatever index or whatever ranking we use, from different sources. But I also try to explore that whether Bangladesh appears as an outlier. This is a scatter plot, and I have plotted log of per capita GDP against the 6 indices of institutions, the synthetic index of institution. And the red dot represent Bangladesh. And you can see that actually these 105 countries, and you can see there is a kind of very strong association between the institutional score and also the log of per capita GDP. And you can see that at the lower end, where the per capita GDP is low, there is a kind of divergence among countries with respect to the performance. But as you just as we move towards a higher per capita GDP, we can see very strong convergence. And Bangladesh doesn't really appear to be a big outlier in this scatter plot. So even if we can see some cases, Bangladesh actually stands a bit away from the trend line, but doesn't appear to be a kind of outlier. I also plotted Bangladesh, I also plotted Bangladesh, the indices against the Human Development Index. And here also the kind of same story. We observe that it's not a kind of very strong outlier. And also the kind of cross-country regression using even the OLS or two-stage least square, using the kind of instrumental variable regression method. Bangladesh variable, the dummy, doesn't appear to be significant at all in any kind of regression. So the point is that Bangladesh is not an outlier in this whole institutional development nexus. So the low performance of Bangladesh is also consistent with the kind of low per capita GDP and lower human development index, when it comes to Bangladesh's institutional performance. We don't actually have a very long time series data on different institutional index, but here I tried to use this World Governance Index to show the kind of progress or kind of change in the institutional index. And as you can see that in certain cases, there is a kind of, we can see a trend of deterioration in over the last 1 decade or so, especially in the case of voice and accountability, in the case of regulatory quality, in the case of government effectiveness, and also in the case of control of corruption. We see the kind of declining trend in the kind of index value. So now, what I come to the kind of very core of this presentation, at the core of this presentation, what we try to argue that there are 4 generic institutional features in Bangladesh's development. The first is that the supremacy of pockets of functional for informal institutions over weak formal institutions, and I'll elaborate on that. And the second one is the supremacy of the deals environment over coordinated industrial policy. And then we have the challenges of effective regulation and the challenge of state capacity. Now let's talk a bit on the supremacy of pockets of functional informal institutions over weak formal institutions. What do I really mean by that? I mean that at the early stage of development, we see the kind of role of informal institutions in many countries. And in Mushtaq Khan's language, if they are growth enhancing rather than market enhancing, then if we take the terms from Land-Pritchett, the deal space, in contrast to rules-based system, where the deals are more like how the private sector they make deals with the government, and the deals can be ordered or disordered, or it can be open or closed. I can come back to these definitional issues in the open discussion or for further clarification later on. But the idea is that at a very lower stage of development, these growth-enhancing informal institutions and the deal space can be helpful for generating stronger growth. But to make a transition from lower stage to development to a higher stage, and that's what Bangladesh is now aspiring, to become an upper middle income country or to become a high income country. So then you need to actually have a transition of this informal institution, and also the formal institution need to be made stronger and functional. So what Bangladesh actually made the kind of success is that Bangladesh could create some pockets of efficient, non-conventional or informal institutions. And that's the examples include the ready-made garment sector, special arrangements for the ready-made garment sector, promotion of labor exports, and the remittance story, agriculture, research and development, and also some special arrangements for the NGOs to function. In many countries, NGOs are not even allowed to function in the way that Bangladesh allowed, the government allowed. And India probably a good example. So it's a kind of hypothesis, but I'll not elaborate much on that. I thought that there are some historical, political, economic perspective why Bangladesh made some success at the early stage, especially the 1971 war, which actually created the kind of entrepreneurship feeling among the economic elites. And also I thought that the 1974 famine made a kind of strong kind of a mark on the mindset of the political elites that to focus on the agricultural development to avoid this kind of famine. Now, the second point is on the supremacy of the deals environment over coordinated industrial policies. Here I'm focusing very much on the very concentrated export basket and the very dominance of the ready-made garment sector. the way the story of the ready-made garment sector, what we call in many cases, the RMG model, that it actually got the benefit out from this MFA regime, and also some of the sector-specific incentives under what I call the deals environment, where those kind of incentives were not extended, or those kind of privileges were not extended to other sectors. So I'll talk about that. And then also we saw that also this sector became competitive, especially the competitiveness came out from the very low cost of labor. But there are some intense challenges ahead, especially the forthcoming loss of LDC status, foreign competitions, technological change, foreign pressure on labor conditions. So the way ready-made garment sector actually, and I can see the kind of growth which Akhtar Bhai projected in his graph, and that growth of ready-made garments export actually has slowed down quite significantly in recent years. But the story of RMG, the RMG model came out as a kind of blockage factor as well. The blockage factor in the sense that in order to have a kind of broad-based industrial policy, which can actually favor other sectors, we did not see this kind of development in Bangladesh. So our industrial policies remained very narrowly focused on favoring certain sectors, especially the ready-made garments. That kind of path dependency, we saw that in the case of ready-made garments, and the past success may have become a kind of constraint. So the deal culture or the deal space has a both positive and negative aspect in Bangladesh. In case of regulation, see the kind of ineffective or corrupt regulation. In the banking sector, I don't really need to elaborate on that. In the case of non-performing loans, in the case of ready-made garment sector, we saw that. In the case of ineffectiveness of the Anti-Corruption Commission, especially it cannot investigate civil servants without government permission. And then also there are some comparable situations of other regulatory agencies, in the case of transport, in the case of health, and we can name some other organizations as well. Now, the fourth area where I see the kind of the challenges related to the state capacity, especially with respect to the tax system, the taxation. Bangladesh has one of the lowest tax jurisdictions in the world, and the complex tax laws, and especially the failure to implement the VAT reform fully, the kind of anti-reform coalition, what we observe in the tax system, involving several stakeholders. And these kind of anti-reform coalitions and stable corruption equilibrium, these are also found in some other areas too, for example, in the health sector and in some aspects of the judicial system. So towards my last part of my presentation, I know that I don't have much time to elaborate on each of these topics, but I thought that, what are the proximate causes of institutional weakness in Bangladesh? One, which I would like to argue that there is an elite capture of the government, the weakness of the labor organizations, especially there was a strong labor organization at in the 70s and 80s, and then over the years we have seen that kind of labor organizations, the weakness, lack of resources and skills in the public sector, stable corruption equilibrium in many cases.
You have 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Anti-reform coalitions, and especially that creates the kind of policy paralysis in many cases, whether it comes to policies for economic diversification or whether it comes to policies for institutional reform or reform in many economic domains. And also we have these inadequate laws and administrative organizations and opacity and unaccountability in many areas. Some of the deep factors behind institutional weakness, I know I don't have time to discuss on this, that the current nature of political settlement, the dominant politics, and the kind of political equilibrium involving the major stakeholders there, the political elites, business elites, military bureaucracy, civil bureaucracy, that kind of stable political settlement there, that can also be acting very much to maintain that kind of status quo. Winner takes all electoral democracy, and then vertical structure of political parties where there are issues whether the democracy is there even within the political parties. The role of the civil society is very complex. The civil society is cited in many cases, they are vibrant, but there are some many pressure on the civil society as well. I know Professor Wadi Mahmood White sir talks quite a lot about on the land issue and the population pressure on land, because Bangladesh comes out as a very outlier in that case. The role of the donors, especially the kind of, they put pressure on the working condition and several other areas. And I also already talked about the dominant party politics. I'll just conclude by saying that there is a need for reform in critical economic and institutional domains. We will not disagree with that. But the question is there a political will to undertake such reform? And the political will is not an exogenous factor. Political will is also an endogenous to various issues, especially related to the domestic politics, related to the geopolitical situation, and also related to the capacity of the
Your time is over.
Interaction with several other stakeholders in that political equilibrium. I'll stop here. I know I had to rush given the time constraint, but I'll be very happy to answer to some of the questions which may arise. Thank you.
Yes, Salim, you have covered a lot in 14 minutes. This is a big story. I know your all background papers, so you have summarized well. The discussant is Dr. Hassan Mansoor, Executive Director, Policy Research Institute, Bangladesh, PRI. Hassan, are you here?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Wadbhai, for good to see you in good shape, good health after a long time.
Thank you.
I must commend Salim for writing a very comprehensive paper. I read through it. It's long, but it's very informative. It's quite comprehensive, and it highlights the issues that we all have been talking about in our professional discourse as well as in our private conversations on the tea tables and so on. This is the heart of that problem also, because institutional weakness is not only limited to the institutions, it spreads into the real economy, into the society, and into the living of every individual as they spend the days and years in the country. So institutions plays a very vital role. And how Bangladesh institutions compares and have done, the scorecards are in the report basically. And they're not very, very pleasant, to be honest. As Salim has put it, Bangladesh's performance is rather mediocre to poor. And almost all the indicators, most of the important indicators are systematically ranged in the lowest quartile. So that's something that's that we need to be concerned about and really pay attention. Particularly poor, we know, and this is not surprising, is the rule of law. In bureaucratic quality, although our bureaucrats are paid quite handsomely, but the quality hasn't improved. Land, synthetic indices, and in all those areas, Bangladesh is 100%. So that speaks volume. Even on the front that we sometimes call Bangladesh champion is democratic index, that we have a good democratic system, trust in politicians, factionalized elites, and other important measures that Salim has put forward shows that there's very little to show for in that front as well. I simply wish that our institutional leadership or the authorities, including the politicians, senior civil bureaucrats, and heads of different organizations like NBR or the police or others, were here to see how Bangladesh institutions, which they are leading, compares with institutions in other countries. And that would be important message to put forward, because we want to see a major shift in that front. The key issue then comes down to what can Bangladesh do well in the growth front despite such weak institutions. That's our main, I would say, the question that comes to our mind. Can we really continue to prosper, do well in future? Yes, I have heard Akhtar Mahmood also. He has gave some drivers of growth which clearly played positive roles, no doubt. But we must also remember that much of those reforms were done in the mid-80s and in the first half of 1990s. Recognition that the private sector will be the driver of future growth came in that time. Privatization also happened to a limited extent at that time. Greater role was given to the private sector in the manufacturing, agriculture, input delivery, and all those things really helped the economies to rebound, including the RMG, including the agricultural revolution and all those things. See, if we had to continue to depend on BADC to provide the power pumps, we probably wouldn't have irrigated our even 1/3 of what we have irrigated in 15 years back by now. So these are institutional reforms that played important role. Financial sector liberalization also played important role, but those happened in the 80s and 90s. Import liberalization also happened at that time, introduction of VAT happened in early 90s. The strong NGO sector, which such gaps in the governance and institutional weaknesses, was also came into action in the 80s and 90s to fill the vacuum. The growth in one driver of our growth is our national savings rate and the national investment rate, which increased from 1970s and 80s until 2010. But thereafter, it's virtually stagnated. It has not gone up, neither the investment ratio nor the savings ratio. Maybe 1%, 1.5% in the last 1 decade. Is that enough to pull us out? Probably not. Weak revenue administration, lowest tax, leading to what? This institution failed to deliver. As a result, tax to GDP ratio is the lowest. So looking forward, the issue that comes to our mind is, can Bangladesh become an upper middle income country and high income country with this kind of weak institutions? Can Bangladesh achieve the SDG targets?
You have 1 minute, sir.
So that remains the dominant theme in our mind. I personally don't see that we can do that miracle with these institutions. That is, we have looked around, and becoming a high income country requires fundamental second, third generation reforms, including the institutional reforms, and that's not happening. High cost of doing business, leading to lower investment, low quality of education, low quality of public health delivery, low FDI inflows, low level of negative public sector savings, entire ADP being funded by borrowed resources. These are not very positive things for the country to look forward to change and achieve the SDG objectives. The amount of resources that will be needed is huge, and the government is nowhere there. So unless fundamental changes happen, I think we may be stuck as a low middle income country for years to come. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mansur. There is Salim can respond a bit. That is not that gloomy, is it?
Thank you, sir.
We are celebrating Bangladesh at 50, so we cannot end with a very gloomy podcast.
We have to take stock at the same time.
Thank you, sir. I think I can take 2 or 3 minutes. I fully agree with you, Fadil Mahmood, that we have many things to celebrate. Actually, definitely, we had a lot of things we achieved over the last 50 years. But the question is probably what Dr. Azam Mansur he posed. I think, can we continue the same kind of thing for the next 50 years or even next 20 years or 10 years? And can we achieve some of these larger development goals? I think I'm kind of double-minded here. Something like I agree with Dr. Azam Mansur, and probably I have written that too in my paper, that it will be seriously very challenging to achieve this kind of development goals for Bangladesh. But keeping aside SDGs, I think if we talk about our income country status, because this is only based on income indicator, I think that is possible. the kind of the way Bangladesh, use the kind of its demographic dividend in a very efficient way, the kind of very low level of demographic at a very low level, using the cheap labor, the garments and remittance, probably that kind of dividend will continue for some more time. So that may actually still keep the policymakers in a more comfort zone, not to undertake larger reforms in the next 5, 6, or 7 years. But I see the next 5 years, hearing Professor Mustafiz Rahman's presentation, that's extremely important for Bangladesh, especially the graduation by 2026. And it is not going to be just the challenge for erosion of preferences, but there will be many other challenges from Bangladesh's competitors. So, but unless and until the policymakers get out from this, the comfort zone, and which is kind of accidentally given to them, I don't really blame them. That comfort zone may come from some crisis situation. It's not that they will be forced to undertake some reforms. So I think we may enjoy, or we may observe some kind of growth phenomena over the next 1 decade or so, if despite some major reform. But I'll just conclude by saying that after 50 years of Bangladesh's independence, I really want to compare Bangladesh. If we were in a kind of in a class, in a school, a class of students, I want to compare Bangladesh with the better performing students, rather than the poor performing students within the class. So the poor performers are honestly Pakistan and India, because they were not the really, when you compare Vietnam or them and also some of the Southeast Asian countries, they're the much better students within the class. So can we compare Bangladesh with their performance? And I think we're still we have a lot of things to do, and to catch up, especially some of the things what they have done. Some of the Southeast Asian countries. And I think that we have many things to learn from them. Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. So that the end of our designated speakers speaking. And we have now some time for question and answer. You can pass on your written question, or anybody can raise hand. We will have 10 minutes of that, I think.
Sir, there are many questions raised in the chat and the Q&A to Dr. Akhtar Mahmood, to Professor Mustafiz.
Can you read out the questions?
Yes, I have actually tried to categorize.
Specific to the panelists.
Yes. Those are more or less specific to Dr. Akhtar Mahmood by Mohammad Musleuddin. Excellent presentation, especially in the line of graphs. You see development since 2000, especially after 2007. We have strong positive developments. You mentioned conducive political economy. Can you please elaborate? Kate Tanha mentioned, why do the stated synergies exist in the state economic relations in Bangladesh? Then Raselul Kader mentioned the sharp difference between 2010 onwards development trajectories and the era before that has not mentioned in Dr. Mahmood's presentation. Nahid Sattar mentioned, can we expect to see other tipping points over the next 10 years or so? These are the points raised to Dr. Akhtar Mahmood. To Professor Mustafiz is Kate Tanha, great presentation. Taiyang Gurung, great analysis, Professor Mustafiz. How was the graduation set to 2041, as UNGA has granted 5 years preparatory phase, indicating that graduation is earlier? You were silent on import-dependent export, but like to your analysis of linkages. Abdul Waris, I'm PhD student. Could you please tell me about what is middle income trap? What are the factors that can contribute to falling in the MI trap? Then another point is that to Professor Mustafiz is that how effective institutions, the propositions made by Professor Mustafiz are unlikely to be real, as we must remember Peter Evans and Chandler Johnson. What is the capacity of negotiation? How do you expect negotiation skills without meritocratic bureaucracy? What meritocratic bureaucracy can be, how meritocratic bureaucracy can be created? What about the BCS exam? Then it is mentioned that a quality of education by Professor Musleuddin. Asiful Islam mentioned, if we go for FTA or SEPA with regional countries, what type of rules of origin would be appropriate? Sarwar Ahmed Salehin mentioned what steps should be taken after LDC graduation. How can we prepare ourselves to cope with the situation when there will be no GSP facilities? Dr. Khan Ahmed Said Murshid, I think, which country is still an LDC? Are we overstating the difficulty of transition? Of course, it is good to be prepared. Nahid Sattar mentioned that what graduations are necessary in our educational institutions for ensuring quality of human capital for Bangladesh to thrive despite the challenges of twin graduation. This question is also for Professor Selim Raihan. To Selim Raihan, these are rather comments. Naomi Hossain, excellent presentation, fascinating analysis, Selim. Mizan Rahman, thanks, Professor Raihan. You are spot on. I see another Mushtaq Khan is on the rise. Many academics are deliberately ignoring the points raised by Professor Raihan. Many love to join the bandwagon, although they know the fallout. So these are the comments and the questions to the panelists.
Good, quite many questions. So we don't need any more questions because we have really 10 minutes more and allotted session time. We could extend it by 5 minutes maybe. So the questions, all the questions I don't expect can be answered, but one by one, can I now invite Akhtar was first?
We have to finish the Q&A by 7:45, sir.
Yes, so we have 10 minutes.
Right, sir.
Akhtar Mahmood.
Yes, thank you. I'll be very quick. So the first question was examples of conducive political economy. So the word political economy is often used as a catch-all phrase, but I'll be very careful in defining it and using the two terms political and economic. So by political economy, I mean how different stakeholders in society organize themselves politically to create pressure on the policymaking process in order to influence economic outcomes. So here, what I meant was that there are different stakeholders, whether related to agriculture, industry, other sectors, who have somehow mobilized themselves to influence the course of policymaking so that the outcomes are aligned with their own interests. So I don't have time to give examples, but that was what I meant by it. The synergy between policy and market, what did I mean by that? I think I made it reasonably clear, but I can clarify. What I'm saying is that developments in the economy, developments in the marketplace often raise issues, and then policy may respond in order to address those issues. If there's a positive development in the economy, you may want to strengthen that development. If there are negative developments, you want to reverse them. So developments in the economy create pressure for policy actions. But when government takes those policy actions, that go back and affect the marketplace, it affects the economy, creates new developments in the economy, which in turn may create demand for further action. Because sometimes, there are constraints which are not binding initially, but once you've taken some policy actions, things have improved, but then new constraints which were not binding before now appear to be binding, and you may have to go and address them. So there is a two-way synergy, and my main point was the synergy has actually played out quite well in Bangladesh. Not in
that was your main point. That was one.
It has played out, and that's very, very, very important. On 2010, post-2010, so if my explanations or my positions in terms of synergies between different economic variables, if that is valid and if powerful synergies were being generated, one characteristic of synergy is that over time, these become more and more powerful. So by the time we come to 2010 or any point like that, a lot of these synergies have already come together to create the perfect storm. So even in the absence of any major change in policy stance, one can expect growth to accelerate. Then the question is, was there something additional in terms of policy interventions? Maybe, maybe not, but that's of course a subject for study. Can we expect other tipping points? Just falling on the logic, perhaps, yes, it's difficult to predict, but despite some of the gloomy pictures that were painted, there's a reasonable chance that these synergies, these dynamics in the economy, quite independent of policy interventions, may create further tipping points down the line. And I think the I guess
okay, pass on. Let's not economists shouldn't make any predictions, otherwise they're proved wrong. So we analyze, we don't predict. So next, can I go to next?
Thank you.
Next one. Okay.
Thank you, sir. I think there were a number of questions, but I don't have that much time. With regard to the import dependence of our export, I was showing that excepting the ready-made garments, our value chains are very weak. I was showing that it's 13% of our export is connected with the global value chains through export and import, whereas in case of Vietnam, it's 67%. And that's why our export is $40 billion and Vietnam's export is $280 billion, although our economic size is greater than Vietnam. So I think that it is a problem. Import dependence is not the problem. Getting into the value chains and having the regional production networks and through backward and forward linkages and based on comparative advantages, that is what we should do. With regard to the effective institutions, I think Selim has looked at that. Negotiating skill, yes, obviously it has to be, how can you do it through whether meritocratic bureaucracy is there? That is a major issue, that we will have to build the negotiating capacities, and that has to be not only in the government. I think that it has to be with professionals both inside the government and outside the government. I think that's how it should be done. It's just not bureaucracy, whether it is meritocratic or not, although meritocratic bureaucracy is what we want. With regard to the rules of origin, I think that it is very important that we design the rules of origin in a way that serves our export interest. So it can be, in various ways, stages of production, like in ready-made garments, 1 stage, 2 stage, 3 stage, or value addition. But what I want to say is that in the rules of origin, it should be regional accumulation as well. You see, in the EU GSP plus scheme also, they allow regional accumulation. So it's just not inside the country. If we can have regional accumulation, then rules of origin also allows accessing from the region and meeting the rules of origin requirements. So that's it. With regard to the LDCs, why Bangladesh's LDC graduation is so important is that from 1971, when LDC was recognized as a separate category, till now, only 6 countries have graduated. And now 16 countries are slated for graduation, and Bangladesh is the first major country. The other 6, they were very small countries. And Bangladesh has taken very good advantage of the preferential access. 70% of our export, it enjoys preferential market access. So the loss of preferential market access will be that much greater for Bangladesh. We have to recognize that. So that's why it's very important. Thank you, sir.
Okay. And Salim?
Yeah, very quickly, sir. I will respond
about being optimistic or pessimistic in terms of
yes. No, I'll be trying to be optimistic.
Deals will be closed or open.
Yes, sir. I just respond to the question on the education sector. I think Naomi also raised that question on this political will, how we can actually have the political will to reform the education sector. But I relate my answer to the health sector as well. I think they have some commonalities in the kind of challenges they face. If we look at the actors in these sectors, either health or education, or either they're public actors or private sector actors or external actors, we see that there are the issues of whether they have the interest for reform and the influence for reform. And we see the huge mismatch. So that means that actors who have the interest for undertaking reform, they don't have any kind of influence over undertaking reform. Or the influential actors, they are not interested in reform. So that means we need to actually, if there is a political will, how actually we can undertake reform in education and health, there must be some actors who have both influence and interest. And I see the huge, there's a need for political will to bring in those actors, maybe innovative actors. In that.
Okay. That should end.
Sir, two persons have raised their hands, sir.
No, I think no more.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Can we conclude? Can I take 5 minutes?
No,
yes,
please.
yes.
No, we insist you take 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Okay, about Akhtar Mahmood, I mean, he when I said that there are two narratives. One is that it was a paradox. It was too much of a surprise given the initial gloomy predictions. Akhtar has done an excellent work of showing how Bangladesh's policies yielded results, first of all, by in terms of policy, synergies between government, donors, and policy, the private sector in a way which was almost like step by step, as the other day mentioned, Deng Xiaoping's cross the river, filling the stones. I think that's what Akhtar was saying. On top of that, he was also saying that there was synergies. All these big accelerations were sequential and had synergies. I mean, obviously, there were synergies, but whether these were causally sequential or was exposed after happening, they proved to be to have positive synergies. That's something one has to more into. About some of these growth accelerations, whatever may be the policy reactions or responses from in the policy space from the private entrepreneurs, there were undeniably unforeseen favorable factors. We can call it luck or whatever it is. The factors like the opening up of opportunities for export of manpower export, the fact that South Korea faced with export quota to US market had to shift to some other country, and at that time the Desh government and the EU took the lead to bring it to Bangladesh. Once all those, the confluence of factors happened, then it took root and government took accommodating actions, and it was cumulative process. One of the synergies Akhtar didn't mention, others mentioned, is that the early in the Ershad period, the early emphasis aided by US aid, supported by US aid, of great emphasis on fertility reduction and family planning. That was on its own right was advocated because Bangladesh was overpopulated. That was saying. But the consequence of that after 20 years is the happy synergy of demographic dividend. At that time, nobody talked about demographic dividend, if I remember. But now everybody talks about demographic dividend and how we can get benefit out of that. Akhtar said that it was an incremental policy. I agree that it's a step-by-step, feel your way. That's okay. But and said that there were no reversal. But I think there were some mistakes, some reversals, at least in the banking sector. Bangladesh made the mistake, first of all, in the 1980s to allow private banks to operate without having a regulatory framework. As a result, towards the end of 1990s, we found that in the private sector, 30% of the deposits were taken away by the sponsored directors. And there were reforms. Again, Akhtar said that these were all incremental. No, in the banking sector in the early 2000s, there was a big bang by Bangladesh Bank in support of some activist judicial system, for which 70 or 80 of sponsored directors were removed for taking away their deposits from their banks. And that helped a lot in improving some of the private banks. But we then went back by again going back to easing the restrictions on family ownership of banks. And we are now making another mistake of in the private sector, in the private banking sector, in the private economy, you can allow mergers, you can allow takeovers, but you have to have again regulatory framework against capture or monopoly capture of sectors, particularly in banking sector, which is so crucial. And there are, the question is, you can explain how we have come so far. I mean, you can explain that there was no paradox, nothing of a big surprise that it came out like that, but you cannot linearly exploit that by saying that the things will go like this and we shall continue to do this. Akhtar didn't mention that, but the others mentioned that there are certain things which are long-term. It's not incremental. The damage we have done to the educational sector in terms of quality over 30 years, particularly in secondary education, that damage can be repaired if we start now by another 30 years. Because it's a chain of how you this secondary education fits into university education and produces teachers who come back to the secondary schools or primary schools. It's a cycle, and it takes time. And incrementalism will also not do in terms of infrastructure and land use pattern planning, because the other day I was saying that if you cannot, incrementalism works when you go forward from where you are, but there are certain things, particularly in Bangladesh's cases, if you really mean that you want to be a high middle income country, then you have to also work backward. What will be the scenario of a high middle income country if we go there? I mean, that we will be producing, the other day I was saying, the GDP per square kilometer of area, which is equivalent or even more than the compared to what is now there in the contemporary industrialized country. So to really go there with an infrastructure, with an end use, with an environmental balance, you cannot go incrementally. That government finds some leeway and private sector response and so on. And Akhtar, you have also written elsewhere that things may deteriorate. I mean, you have emphasized here in explaining Bangladesh's progress that private sector responded to whatever policy the area was given by policy. But you have said that market-friendly policies are different from can move into business-friendly policies, which means favoring some businesses with largesse and some extra benefit in terms of big contracts, which ultimately can degenerate into crony capitalism. So those are the future challenges. It's not a linear path. That brings me to Salim Raihan's presentation, where he mentioned that Bangladesh is not, given its per capita income now, is not that much of an outlier in terms of all other development indicators. But it is very much an outlier in terms of growth rates. It's one of the fastest growing economy in the world. So there is something there which you have to analyze how you have also said that the as countries develop, then there is a much better relationship between development indicators and per capita income. So everything converge, which means that in cross-section data in more developed countries, all these governance factors and per capita income, they're much correlated. But in the lower stage of development, there is not much correlation. But how do you go there is the problem. That's it's very specific to countries. That's why your regressions across countries give good results, but no growth regressions using any of these indicators. In spite of all the works of Robert Barrow and Rodriguez and other things, will give good results, which means that we still do not know how each country can really go from here to there where everything converges. And
sir, could you please sum up in 2 minutes? Yes, sir, our next session will be started at 8.
Yes, my last word is therefore that Akhtar didn't mention one thing in his presentation, but I read it in his paper, which is he mentioned Frank Sinatra's great song, which is I Did It My Way, which means Bangladesh, in spite of all those alleged the doomy predictions and the governance problems, we overcame all that by doing it in our own way. But it also reminds me of another more modern stories. You see, when times changes, then tunes also have to change. And many of you, but I think younger people are now most familiar with the most the songwriter and the singer who is now most popular. She's English. She's Adele. Adele is a songwriter also, and he's one of the most famous songs says, I was still a child, didn't get the chance to fill the world around me. So that is Mustafi's problem, that there are so many traps, and we are now going into the wide, big world without any concessions. So how do we negotiate around those things with so many traps? We have overcome the LDC trap in quite many years. Now Mustafi said that there are traps everywhere. So we have to analyze those traps and find our way. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to be with you. And I can see that the attendance is, my God, it's 115. I mean, it's amazing. It must be the attractive power of Sir, Professor Rahman Soban and Professor Raunak Jahan, that they could attract so many audience. I'm so glad about that, and I'm grateful to Sir that for inviting me to share this session.
I think it is also the attraction of you and the rest of the panelists who have logged into this particular panel. Raymond and I have nothing to do with this panel, but we'll greatly learn from this panel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. We'd like to invite you to join the next panel in a separate link. We are closed this session now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Recording stop.